Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
They packed their suitcases like it was a family tradition, the kind where everyone knew their role. My mother fussed over sunscreen and sandals. My father checked the passports twice. And my brother Evan strutted around the kitchen waving his boarding pass, as if it were a medal he'd earned for surviving another year of doing absolutely nothing. He called it a spiritual reset. I called it Tuesday. The Maldives, business class, the best resort on the island. I stood at the counter peeling the plastic off a frozen lasagna and smiled as he bragged about underwater villas and private chefs. My parents looked at him the way people look at a new puppy, pure delight mixed with denial of the mess it's about to cause. When they told me they'd be gone for 2 weeks and needed someone to watch the house, they said it the same way people say, "Could you water the plants?" My mother added, "You know how responsible you are, Grace. We trust you." It was meant to sound like a compliment, but it landed like a sentence. They didn't even realize I'd taken extra shifts that week to help cover the property taxes, or that I hadn't been on a vacation in almost 7 years. I laughed and said sure, like always, because in this family, quiet agreement kept things smooth, at least on the surface. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the living room with the half-packed suitcase they hadn't noticed in the corner. It was mine. I hadn't used it since a college trip I barely afforded, back when Evan was still just a loud teenager with big dreams and zero follow-through. Now he was a 32-year-old freelancer whose biggest accomplishment was convincing our parents that unemployment was a personality type. Every time I paid a bill or fixed a broken light, they told me how lucky they were to have such a steady daughter. Every time he crashed a car or quit another job, they said, "He's still finding himself." I started remembering all the little betrayals, the ones that didn't look like betrayals at first. The Christmas they gave him a car and me a sweater. The graduation where he forgot to show up but still got a family dinner in his honor because he'd been stressed lately. The time Mom used my savings to help him get back on his feet and then called me ungrateful for bringing it up. It wasn't hatred I felt, just a slow-burning understanding that I didn't belong in their story the way I thought I did. I wasn't the daughter. I was the safety net. The next morning, I watched their car roll down the driveway, luggage stacked neatly, my father waving at the house like it was me. Evan honked twice and shouted out the window, "Don't burn the place down," as if I were the reckless one. The quiet that followed was heavier than usual, like the house itself was waiting for me to start cleaning up after them. I made a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and stared at the street. For the first time, I didn't feel sad that they'd left. I felt something closer to curiosity. What would happen if I just didn't wait for them to come back? I opened my laptop and typed one-way ticket, followed by the name of every city I could think of. I didn't care where, I just wanted gone. The prices flickered across the screen like invitations. I closed the window, heart pounding, and told myself I was being dramatic. But then I caught sight of the family photo on the shelf, Evan in the center, holding a drink, Mom's hand on his shoulder, Dad laughing, me slightly off to the side like an afterthought. I stood up, took the frame down, and laid it face down on the table. By noon, I'd cleaned the kitchen, fed the cat, and started packing again, not for them this time. It felt strange how calm I was, like I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head. I packed only what I needed, a few clothes, my laptop, the small wooden jewelry box that used to belong to my grandmother. They'd promised it to me years ago, then forgot and kept it locked away because Evan had shown interest. I smiled as I slid it into my bag. Grandma would have approved. She was the only one who ever noticed how much I gave up just to keep the peace. That night, I made dinner for one, not out of sadness, but ritual. I poured a glass of cheap wine, sat at the table, and ate slowly, thinking about every version of myself that had stayed quiet to keep everyone else comfortable. The responsible daughter. The peacekeeper. The invisible adult. And somewhere between the last sip and the sound of the dishwasher starting, I realized that if I didn't leave soon, I never would. I went upstairs, shut the door, and opened my laptop again. The cursor blinked at me like a dare. I typed one-way ticket, anywhere, and hit search. There it was, a flight leaving in 3 days to a coastal town I'd never heard of. The ticket was cheap, the kind that doesn't promise a return. I bought it without thinking. Then I opened a notebook and wrote one line across the first page. 2 weeks. They'll come home to an empty house. I stared at it for a long time before closing the cover. It wasn't revenge yet, not really. But it was the beginning of something that would change everything for them and for me. And as I turned off the lights that night, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like permission. They packed their suitcases like it was a family tradition, the kind where everyone knew their role. My mother fussed over sunscreen and sandals, my father checked the passports twice, and my brother Evan strutted around the kitchen waving his boarding pass as if it were a medal he'd earned for surviving another year of doing absolutely nothing. He called it a spiritual reset. I called it Tuesday. The Maldives business class, the best resort on the island. I stood at the counter peeling the plastic off a frozen lasagna and smiled as he bragged about underwater villas and private chefs. My parents looked at him the way people look at a new puppy, pure delight mixed with denial of the mess it's about to cause. When they told me they'd be gone for 2 weeks and needed someone to watch the house, they said it the same way people say, "Could you water the plants?" My mother added, "You know how responsible you are, Grace. We trust you." It was meant to sound like a compliment, but it landed like a sentence. They didn't even realize I'd taken extra shifts that week to help cover the property taxes, or that I hadn't been on a vacation in almost 7 years. I laughed and said sure, like always, because in this family, quiet agreement kept things smooth, at least on the surface. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the living room with the half-packed suitcase they hadn't noticed in the corner. It was mine. I hadn't used it since a college trip I barely afforded, back when Evan was still just a loud teenager with big dreams and zero follow-through. Now he was a 32-year-old freelancer whose biggest accomplishment was convincing our parents that unemployment was a personality type. Every time I paid a bill or fixed a broken light, they told me how lucky they were to have such a steady daughter. Every time he crashed a car or quit another job, they said, "He's still finding himself." I started remembering all the little betrayals, the ones that didn't look like betrayals at first. The Christmas they gave him a car and me a sweater. The graduation where he forgot to show up but still got a family dinner in his honor because he'd been stressed lately. The time Mom used my savings to help him get back on his feet and then called me ungrateful for bringing it up. It wasn't hatred I felt, just a slow-burning understanding that I didn't belong in their story the way I thought I did. I wasn't the daughter. I was the safety net. The next morning, I watched their car roll down the driveway, luggage stacked neatly, my father waving at the house like it was me. Evan honked twice and shouted out the window, "Don't burn the place down," as if I were the reckless one. The quiet that followed was heavier than usual, like the house itself was waiting for me to start cleaning up after them. I made a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and stared at the street. For the first time, I didn't feel sad that they'd left. I felt something closer to curiosity. What would happen if I just didn't wait for them to come back? I opened my laptop and typed one-way ticket, followed by the name of every city I could think of. I didn't care where, I just wanted gone. The prices flickered across the screen like invitations. I closed the window, heart pounding, and told myself I was being dramatic. But then I caught sight of the family photo on the shelf, Evan in the center, holding a drink, Mom's hand on his shoulder, Dad laughing, me slightly off to the side like an afterthought. I stood up, took the frame down, and laid it face down on the table. By noon, I'd cleaned the kitchen, fed the cat, and started packing again, not for them this time. It felt strange how calm I was, like I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head. I packed only what I needed, a few clothes, my laptop, the small wooden jewelry box that used to belong to my grandmother. They'd promised it to me years ago, then forgot and kept it locked away because Evan had shown interest. I smiled as I slid it into my bag. Grandma would have approved. She was the only one who ever noticed how much I gave up just to keep the peace. That night, I made dinner for one, not out of sadness, but ritual. I poured a glass of cheap wine, sat at the table, and ate slowly, thinking about every version of myself that had stayed quiet to keep everyone else comfortable. The responsible daughter. The peacekeeper. The invisible adult. And somewhere between the last sip and the sound of the dishwasher starting, I realized that if I didn't leave soon, I never would. I went upstairs, shut the door, and opened my laptop again. The cursor blinked at me like a dare. I typed, one-way ticket, anywhere, and hit search. There it was, a flight leaving in 3 days to a coastal town I'd never heard of. The ticket was cheap, the kind that doesn't promise a return. I bought it without thinking. Then I opened a notebook and wrote one line across the first page, 2 weeks. They'll come home to an empty house. I stared at it for a long time before closing the cover. It wasn't revenge yet, not really. But it was the beginning of something that would change everything for them and for me. And as I turned off the lights that night, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like permission. Write without short sentences. Sentences should be meaningful and full of content. Don't use emojis. Generate only the title of the section and the story text itself, no subheadings. Give only the episode number and clean text without extra system words, comments, or service phrases. Each episode should be no less than 4,500 characters or 600 plus words. Don't use more than 750 words in an episode. Let's move on to the next episode. ChatGPT. 14th. Episode 2, The List. The morning after I bought the one-way ticket, I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in it and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, because if I was going to disappear without turning mean or dramatic, I would need a plan that looked boring on the surface yet shifted the ground under their feet in ways they would not immediately understand, and it started with a list that read like chores but felt like freedom. A slow inventory of everything I had been quietly carrying for years and a line-by-line decision to set each piece down. I wrote, feed the cat, and immediately crossed it out because I walked 3 houses down to Mrs. Delgado, who had loved our cranky orange animal since the day he wandered into her garden, and I signed a simple adoption form she had printed from the internet. Then I tucked the veterinarian records into a folder and left it on her hall table with an envelope of cash for food, since love deserves something more solid than promises, and I refused to let my escape make a creature pay for our family's laziness. I wrote, water the plants, but instead I gifted the ferns to the nurse who worked nights across the street and always waved at me in silence on her way to her car, because even plants deserve a home where someone notices when the leaves droop. And the empty windowsills felt like a rehearsal for the empty house that would soon echo with the sound of my absence. My pen moved faster as caffeine and courage braided into a single rope, and I listed the invisible work that nobody called work, the autopay accounts I set up when my father forgot passwords, the garbage service I negotiated down to a cheaper rate, the homeowner's policy I revised after the hailstorm, the streaming subscriptions my brother needed for creative research, the gym membership my mother renewed for him while insisting he was about to start, the little household emergencies that had trained me to perform competence on command, and I opened each portal, one by one, breathing through the indignation that wanted to write a speech, and instead I did something colder and cleaner by changing the contact numbers to my parents' phones, removing my card details, and disabling the backup email that kept everything from collapsing whenever Evan misplaced his device again. The revenge in those clicks was small and silent and perfectly measured because it did not humiliate them or burn a bridge. It only returned every responsibility to its rightful owner with the quiet authority of a library stamp, and I allowed myself a single smile when the confirmation screens stacked up like dominoes falling in reverse. I packed a single duffel like I was negotiating with gravity, choosing clothes that worked in any weather and shoes I could stand in all day, and I set aside my grandmother's wooden jewelry box, the one they promised and forgot, and then pretended had no owner. And I opened it at the dining table where we once blew out birthday candles for my brother on the night of my master's graduation, because his feelings were hurt by the attention, and he needed a win, and inside the box I found the thin gold chain I used to play with as a child while my grandmother told me that love without respect is simply dependency with nicer dishes, and I slipped the chain on, let the pendant warm against my throat, and felt something subtle that had been rattling for years. I wrote, talk to HR, because I had carried the benefits paperwork for my father's contracting work on my back like an unpaid assistant, and instead of a confrontation I sent a tidy email from my personal account stating that effective Immediately all inquiries should go directly to him, and I attached the encrypted file with step-by-step instructions he had refused to learn. And I CC'd the office manager who once thanked me for acting like a daughter to a man who did not believe daughters needed boundaries, and I closed my laptop with the gentle satisfaction of someone wiping a counter for the last time. Because I kept promises even when people did not deserve them, I left the house in better shape than I found it, but I salted the earth of my unpaid labor with a few strategic choices that felt like kindness to me and consequence to them. Like placing the spare keys in a sealed envelope at the bank's safe deposit counter with a note that said, "For Robert and Elaine upon presentation of identification," which meant no more frantic calls from the driveway because Evan lost his set at a beach bar. And like printing a simple sheet labeled "Who to call when things break" and taping it inside the pantry door, a list of plumbers and electricians and insurance adjusters with their direct lines and their specialty. Because the truth was I wasn't trying to ruin their lives, I was just finally refusing to live mine as a service desk. I scheduled a message to send the day their plane landed, brief and unnerving in its politeness, explaining that I had taken a position out of town and would not be reachable for a while, that the cat was safe and adored, that the utilities were in their names, that the lawn company would expect a call if they wanted to keep the same rate, and that the household passwords were printed and sealed in the top right drawer of the desk if they wished to learn what I had always known. There was no accusation in the language, no lecture, only the cool, professional finality of a resignation letter to a manager who never learned your last name. When my list reached the bottom of the page, I added one last line and circled it twice, not because I needed the reminder, but because a ritual demands its own witness, and the line said, "Turn off the phone," which I did after transferring the last 2 family text threads to an archive and backing up the photos, and the quiet that followed felt like standing at the lip of a lake at night just before you break the surface and swim. And in that hush I felt the shape of a future that did not revolve around my brother's latest reinvention or my parents' curated helplessness, a future built on the ordinary magic of paying my own bills and answering only for myself. I slipped the chain under my shirt, zipped the duffel, left the house with the curtains drawn exactly as my mother liked them, locked the door, and slid the envelope with the keys into my bag until the bank opened. And as I walked down the street, I realized that my first real act of revenge had already happened at the kitchen table, written in legal pad ink and confirmed in a dozen quiet systems, because by the time they came back tanned and glowing and ready to resume the old script, the roles would be gone, the lines erased, and the stage lights would come up on nothing but their own reflections. The first bus out of town left before sunrise, and as it groaned past the empty hardware store and the bakery that only smelled generous when the owner wanted to unload yesterday's donuts, I sat by the window with my duffel under my feet and my grandmother's chain warming against my skin, watching the familiar streets recede like a set being struck after a long-running play, the props shoved into storage, the audience gone, and the actress finally walking home in her own shoes, which felt both lighter and more honest than anything I had worn in that house in years. I had chosen a coastal town a few states away not because it was romantic or cinematic or any of the other soft focus words my mother used when she wanted to make something hard sound pretty, but because it was ordinary in a way that would let me disappear without explanation, a place where the air tasted faintly of salt and fryer oil, where people minded their own business until you gave them a good reason not to, and where the ocean was always there to stare at when your thoughts needed a horizon bigger than your family's opinions. By noon I had rented a studio above a shop that sold cheap kites and sunscreen to tourists who believed windburn counted as personality, and the landlord, a woman with a bulldog face and a schoolteacher voice, accepted my cash deposit with a grunt of approval and a single instruction about trash pickup that I wrote down like scripture, because the magic of a new life is not grand gestures, it is schedules and keys and a lock that clicks for you alone. The apartment was not much, a square of scuffed hardwood and a window that stuck halfway, but the first time I set a glass of water on the counter and knew nobody would move it, I felt a physical shift in my body, like a weight sliding off a packed shelf. And I stood there breathing through the shock of realizing peace does not always arrive with music and flowers. Sometimes it arrives carrying a socket wrench and a grocery list. I walked to the pier with a paper bag of groceries and let the gulls laugh at me while I ate an apple that actually tasted like an apple, and I told myself aloud that I was not auditioning for a better family or a cleaner story. I was simply building a small, durable world where my voice did not need permission to take up space. Work came faster than I expected, because every beach town runs on caffeine, and the cafe on the corner needed someone who could hustle without turning cranky, so I poured coffee, wiped tables, learned the regulars' names, and made a private sport of identifying tourists who thought tips were optional because they had spent their generosity on flip-flops, and the owner, a man whose eyebrows did more talking than his mouth, paid me in cash the first week while the paperwork caught up, which suited me fine because I had no interest in broadcasting my arrival beyond the narrow circle required to pay rent and keep the lights on. At closing, when the espresso machine hissed its last satisfied breath, I filled a small tin with spare change and paper napkins and carried it down to the beach, where I wrote postcards in clean block letters. The way I used to label the freezer meals my mother forgot to defrost, and I chose cards with sunsets and pelicans and a pier that could have been anywhere, and I addressed them to my parents' house with no return address, because sometimes a ghost needs to rattle a friendly chain just so the living know they are haunted by more than their own convenience. I kept my humor like a pocket knife, small and sharp and useful, and when I mailed the first card I wrote, "Wish you were here watering the ferns," and when I mailed the second I wrote, "Met a woman who remembered to feed herself first and she seemed to be doing great," and when I mailed the third I wrote nothing at all, only taped my grandmother's favorite type of pressed flower inside, a sprig of lavender I had carried wrapped in wax paper since she died, because I wanted my mother to open something that smelled like care and understand that care and control are not synonyms, no matter how many times she rehearsed that trick in our kitchen. I bought a prepaid phone and programmed exactly 3 numbers into it: the cafe, the landlord, and a legal aid clinic whose website I had read twice on the bus, because the cleaner my life became, the more clearly I saw that leaving home was not a tantrum. It was a contract adjustment, and if I wanted my exit to hold, it needed to be written in the adult language my family only respected when it arrived on embossed letterhead. So on my second free afternoon, I walked into a small office that smelled like toner and determination, and I sat with an attorney who listened without blinking while I explained the mortgage payments I had made for years, the repairs I had coordinated, the insurance calls I had handled, and the quiet way my parents had treated my work as a natural resource they could tap forever without paying the bill. And he did not promise a rescue or a lightning bolt. He offered something better: paperwork. That returned my time and money to my jurisdiction and put my signature between them and the house like a steel bar they could not charm their way around. We drafted a letter that did not accuse, it merely itemized. And attached to it we prepared a transfer instrument for my share of the property interest that directed any future proceeds above the principal I had covered to a local shelter that housed women who needed exactly what I had needed on that bus before sunrise: a door that locked and a small room that let them breathe long enough to remember their real names. When I left the clinic, I mailed one more postcard, this one with a photo of an empty shoreline and a line that read, "You'll know when you've lost me for good." And then I bought a cup of chowder from a place that accepted cash with a wink, and I sat on the pier counting out the change I would need for the certified mail fees the next day, because my revenge was not a scream or a scene or a viral moment. It was a stack of documents moving through the postal system like a quiet procession, each envelope a boundary wearing a suit, and as the sun slid behind a bank of clouds and the wind picked up, I tucked the lavender-scented card receipts into my pocket and listened to the waves count in slow, even numbers. A rhythm that sounded exactly like a clock learning a new house, and I knew that when their plane wheels touched down and their phones lit up with messages about lawn care and utility bills and the curious absence of their reliable daughter, there would be one envelope waiting on the hall table that sat squarely in the center of the story, and it would not beg or explain or apologize. It would simply ask for a signature. They came home sunburned and glossy with the kind of post-vacation self-satisfaction that photographs try to hold but never quite can. dragging wheeled suitcases over the porch step while arguing about whether the resort coffee was actually good or whether the ocean air merely made everything taste like novelty. And for a long moment they did not notice anything unusual, because habit is a magician that keeps pulling the same rabbit from the same hat until nobody questions where the fur comes from. Then my mother put her hand on the hall table for balance and found no stack of mail to complain about, no cat to scold for shedding on the runner. No glass left absent-mindedly near a ring of condensation I would normally wipe before she formed the thought to ask, and I imagine she called my name once in that sing-song voice she used when she wanted a favor disguised as a hello. And then again with the petty edge that crept in whenever her first attempt at charm failed to produce immediate service. My father set the suitcases upright and frowned at the quiet like it owed him an explanation, then pulled out his phone and started pacing, because that is what men in our family do when reality refuses to load. And he dialed my number and heard the clean mechanical statement that the line had been disconnected, which to him sounded like defiance, but to me had become the hum of a power station I finally owned. They moved deeper into the house, as if the rooms might offer commentary, opening doors that offered only their own hinges, and in the kitchen my mother reached for the pantry out of muscle memory and found, taped to the inside, the plain sheet I had labeled, "Who to call when things break," with a list of names and specialties and direct lines, and she stood very still because the artifact made a quiet argument she could not refute. The work she dismissed as natural had always been learned, tracked, scheduled, and performed by a person she forgot to see, and now the sheet spoke where I no longer would. My father opened the desk drawer and saw the sealed envelope bearing their names, then opened it to find the passwords he had never bothered to learn and a tidy index of the accounts whose monthly appearance he had treated as acts of God. And he ran a finger down the page as if the letters might rearrange themselves into a confession that I was only taking a weekend, that I would return after a theatrical pout, that this absence was a storm to be waited out rather than a climate they had created across years, and when the letters refused to blink he set the list down with an awkward care usually reserved for crystal and fragile egos. I imagine the first voicemail from Evan arrived before they had finished during the silence, his voice charged with the bravado of a man who assumes a stage will appear wherever he stands, telling me to stop being a drama queen, telling me to come home because the cat needed feeding, telling me he would Venmo me for groceries, which was his idea of an apology because currency is the only language he speaks without stumbling, and when the second message landed it arrived rougher around the edges, a little mean in the way fear makes children lash out, promising to change while listing no specifics, promising to be a better brother while accidentally reminding me of everything that phrase had never cost him, and then, as the evening thinned, there was a third call that did not leave a message, only held open a line to the soft static of a house that had never learned to carry its own weight. My mother, being my mother, found a different audience and called our neighbor under the pretext of returning a borrowed cake pan, and after 2 minutes of neighborly chatter she learned that the cat had been whisked into a life of soft blankets, that the ferns were thriving in another window, that the nurse across the street had a new smile whenever she came home from the night shift, and my mother said something polite and brittle that meant, "How dare Grace?" while the neighbor said something warm and ordinary that meant, "How wise?" And then my mother set the phone down with the puzzled expression of a person realizing that generosity can be a scalpel. Because panic is a scavenger that eats manners first, my father opened my bedroom door without knocking and found the emptiness I had left on purpose, hangers facing the same direction, the outline of a jewelry box missing from the shelf, the air carrying no scent but dust and the faintest trace of the lavender my grandmother once tied to drawer pulls, and he stood with one hand on the door jamb like a man who has walked through the same doorway for decades and has only now looked up to see the lintel, and in that pause I like to think he remembered the winter I spent sick on the couch while still filing his tax receipts and sorting his pharmacy orders, the spring I painted the fence while Evan made plans to be a filmmaker, the summer I drove my mother to physical therapy twice a week, while she talked the entire ride about the stress of managing other people's needs. They searched for the cat bowl and found it gone, searched for the watering can and found an empty space, opened the utility portal and discovered that every account now required their numbers, their decisions, their patience, and when my mother asked who would handle the quarterly property tax reminder, my father offered the brave answer of "we will," in a tone that asked, "How?" And then the doorbell rang with the brutal punctuality of a clock reaching a chime it has counted toward all day. On the hall table sat a certified envelope addressed to both of them in a formal typeface that makes even simple statements sound like verdicts, and when they signed for it with the pens I used to keep stocked beside the notepad labeled, "Things Mom will forget she asked me to do," they broke the seal and found the itemized letter that converted their memory of my helpfulness into a ledger of hours and payments and quiet agreements, followed by the clean paragraphs of the transfer instrument, drafted to prevent my future from being eaten by their past. And while the words did not accuse, the structure did, because nothing looks more like accountability than black ink that refuses to blink. The letter was not the revenge, it was the paperwork that made revenge unnecessary, and yet I had left one small line near the end that functioned like a key inside a lock, explaining that any proceeds beyond the principal I had covered would be directed to a shelter that housed women who wanted exactly what I had claimed on a bus before dawn: a room, a lock, a name returned, and my mother read that line twice with the same expression she once wore when I refused to shrink to fit a dress she liked, while my father pressed his thumb to the page hard enough to leave a print he could not see. That night, as the house sat like a stage after the audience has left, their phones lit with incoming messages from neighbors, from the lawn service, from the streaming platforms asking to confirm new ownership, and from Evan, who sent a fourth voice note, this one small and unarmored, asking what he should do about dinner, and the cliff they now stood on was not built of my anger, but of their own unpracticed independence, which was, in its way, the sharpest edge I could provide. The morning I mailed the envelope that would do all the speaking I refused to do, the town woke in the way beach towns always wake when the heat has not yet climbed and the gulls sound competitive enough to qualify for a union. And I walked to the post office with my grandmother's chain tucked under the collar of a thrifted blouse, rehearsing nothing because the words had been shaped already into that clean, unsentimental geometry that lawyers prefer. A language that does not tremble even when the hand holding it does, and I slid the certified packet across the counter with the steadiness of a person who has finally learned that silence can be a full sentence when it is backed by choices that leave no soft edges to tug. I watched the clerk stamp the date 3 times as if he were sealing off a wound, and I thought about how long I had spent leaving myself open to small cuts that were never dramatic enough to require stitches, but always deep enough to ache when the weather changed, and I understood that my revenge, if anyone needed to call it that, was not a scream or a spectacle or a cascade of perfect lines delivered to a camera, but a structural adjustment that returned my hours to my possession and made my leaving something they could not cancel with a tearful dinner followed by a familiar promise that next time would feel different in ways it never did. Back at the cafe, I pulled espresso like a woman who has a stake in the future beyond whether someone rings a bell over dessert. And when the rush thinned, I set my phone on the counter and listened to the messages stack up with the grim curiosity of a person reading weather reports for a storm already crossing another coastline. Because my father had found his voice in formal mode and called to say that the letter had arrived and the figures shocked him, not because he doubted them but because written proof feels rude when you have floated for years on the cushion of other people's unrecorded effort, while my mother, who once taught me that presentation shapes perception, left a note that sounded like a recipe for reconciliation if you ignored the missing ingredients, and Evan, who had mastered the science of improvising apologies without attaching them to action, left 2 messages separated by a short space of breath in which you could hear the house echoing, the first loud with sarcasm about my disappearing act, and the second soft with a kind of fear he could not name without shrinking, a simple request for me to call because he did not know where the mixing bowls were and felt embarrassed by the depth of that realization. I let the messages sit like museum pieces and walked down to the pier with a paper cup of chowder, letting the steam fog my face while the wind pulled at the edges of a life I refused to surrender to anyone's expectation of a dramatic return. And I opened a small notebook to copy, in my own handwriting, the plainest summary of what the letter had accomplished, that my contributions had been recognized without a fight scene, that the accounts had been permanently redirected toward the people who used them, that my share in the property had been legally conditioned to protect my exit from the gravitational pull of obligation dressed up as love, and that a portion of anything beyond bare principle would go, without negotiation or revision, to women who would need exactly what I had needed the day I chose a bus over a welcome home cake, a key and a bed and a door that closed. The pen scratched the page like a tiny saw, and in the distance a child argued with the tide about fairness, and I understood, with a relief so clean it almost hurt, that I had aged out of the role of house translator, the person who made messy human choices sound noble enough to keep the story moving, and that the only translation I owed anyone now was the conversion of my time into my life. At sunset, when the cafe windows turned the color of old honey and the customers trickled away to dinners that would probably end with a detour through memory, my prepaid phone lit with an unknown number that still carried the shape of a house to my ear. And I answered, because I am not cruel, only finished, and my father's voice arrived surprisingly plain, stripped of the confidence that depends on other people's spinning plates, and he said my name in the careful way people say the names of bridges when they are not sure whether to cross, and he told me they had read the letter twice and understood it once, and that he would sign where the attorney had indicated, because even he could not argue with ink that never raised its volume, and that my mother was upstairs putting together a box of my things that had somehow remained despite the deliberate emptiness I left, and he asked, not in accusation but in a tentative reaching way, whether I might want any of it returned, and I told him there was nothing in that house I needed, because I finally owned the one item that could not be shipped. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said a small thanks, not for the letter, but for the list on the pantry door, because he had called the plumber and discovered that grown men can learn numbers when they must. And when the silence stretched again, I heard in it both the beginning of his humility and the outline of its limits, and we let the quiet stand where apologies might have gone until it felt like a structure rather than an accident. After we hung up, I sat on the pier and played the last voicemail from Evan, the one that had landed after dinner when the house must have started to breathe funny, because nobody was there to tell it what came next, and his voice, unbrushed for once by charm, asked if I could please tell him which night the trash went out and whether the lawn company took checks and whether Mom liked the sound of the dishwasher or preferred it run when she was out, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said that if I ever wanted to talk he would listen, which was a sentence he had never constructed before without a punchline hovering behind it, and for a moment I felt the ache that follows a well-executed stretch, the kind that means muscles have remembered a shape they should have been holding all along. I did not call back, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I needed him to stand, and I watched the line of the horizon harden into night as the ocean kept its stubborn rhythm, and I told myself the truth I had avoided in smaller rooms, that love without respect is a chore chart, that peace secured through paperwork can coexist with grief, and that the cleanest endings often leave one door unlatched on purpose so that, years from now, if two people have actually changed rather than rehearsed it, they can nudge it open without forcing anyone to move back in. When I finally walked home through streets that smelled of salt and frying onions, I unlocked my own door and set my bag down in the same corner it always hit, and I made tea with the confidence of someone who knows where the mugs live. And I stood by the open window letting the air print itself on my skin, and I understood that the story would end here for now because endings are only pauses we respect long enough to hear ourselves breathe, and if one day a letter arrived in my mailbox written in a hand I recognized, offering no excuses and requesting nothing but a conversation on neutral ground with the ocean between us, I might read it twice, understand it once, and set it aside for the length of time required to make sure my piece was not a costume I could remove under pressure. Then I would decide like a person whose life finally fits in her own mouth, and whether I said yes or no. It would be the kind of answer that does not need witnesses to count.